fan was for fanning the flames of my funeral pyre. Just one letter have I retained from this rather inglorious period of my journalistic career. It came from an elderly-sounding gentleman in the seaside town of Bognor Regis, who signed himself both with his name and his army rank, which happened to be Major. Here it is in full. Dear Winchester, I read your disgraceful article today while on holiday in Spain. I have never in my life read or seen anything so dreadful. It caused me to vomit profusely. I had to end my holiday immediately and return to England. I wish to tell you that I regard you, sir, as a total scoundrel. If I ever encounter you in a street in London, I promise you, sir, that I will denounce you publicly and will then give you a sound thrashing with a horsewhip. Major Ambrose Wilson. His name I made up. The rest is true. And I've happily never met the gentleman, but I have never eaten a dog since. I did once eat a cat, though. Cat stew. It was given to me by a nun in West Africa. I wrote about that also, but no one, not even the galloping major, ever wrote in to complain.
Thank you, Simon. Sometimes travel presents these opportunities. Our next reader is Elizabeth Eves. Elizabeth has written for the New York Times, World Hum, Slate. She's been anthologized in the Best American Travel Writing twice. And she's the author of Bear and of a forthcoming book called Wanderlust. Elizabeth Eves.
So my story is about Jerusalem, where I've been a few times, and that's all you need to know, except I have to apologize to Hebrew and Arabic speakers for the words I am going to mangle in here. Okay. Khan el-Zayt, the street of the oil merchants, was where I stayed the first time I went to Jerusalem, which was in 1992. It was a souk, a covered passageway lined with small stores, all open to the street. I could tell when the owners put out their wares in the morning because the fragrances rose up to my third-story room. The vats of olives gave off a salty tang, and every bag of spice had its own scent. I smelled turmeric, cumin, cardamom, and more flavors that I couldn't recognize. Among the food stores there were shops selling cheap sneakers, bras, and polyester Leonardo DiCaprio carpet. Later that year, I went back to Jerusalem, and I got a job in a youth hostel on the same street. The building was made of ancient stone, and I shared a room with whatever other guests came along. In exchange for room and board, and for a few shekels a week, I cleaned the hostel and fetched guests from the bus station. I led them down the stone steps in front of Damascus Gate, through the long portal, around the donkey carts, and back into the old city. Damascus Gate was the commercial heart of the Muslim quarter, and the plaza just inside the gate was always thronged with vendors and shoppers. My charges were always from the most neutral places: Switzerland, Canada, New Zealand. I led them up Khan el-Zayt and inhaled as we passed the spices. In 1998, I went to Jerusalem again, now with a summer job as an intern for a wire service. During my first two visits, I'd rarely ventured into Jewish West Jerusalem, and now I would live there. The Muslim quarter of the old city had always felt to me like a tidier extension of the Arab world, so this was my first real introduction to Israel. It was the first time I was surrounded by Hebrew and by Jewish Israelis. In West Jerusalem, the white stone buildings seemed to glow at night, and outside of the Orthodox neighborhoods, the girls wore tank tops. On my first day of work, my boss introduced me to another intern, Sarah, who was an ambitious photographer. "You from the States?" she asked. "Yeah, no, where'd you go to college?" she asked, cracking her gum. "University of Washington," I said. "Jews, you?" I stared at her. "Jews, you? Wash, you?" I still couldn't make out what she was talking about. "Washington University?" she asked. "Oh, University of Washington, in Seattle, UW. "Oh," she said. "I thought you meant Washington University in St. Louis. Never mind, that's what people call it. Are you Jewish?" "No." "Right, see, I assumed you were Jewish." Anyway, I went to Penn. We should get a drink. I agreed. Sarah and I rented a breezy ground floor apartment in the neighborhood of Rehavia. Together we took the bus every day to the well-fortified JMC, the Jerusalem Media Center, where nearly every foreign news organization had its offices. Almost everyone else in my bureau was either Jewish or Arab. Some were from Jerusalem, while others had come from elsewhere to work: Jordan, Egypt, England, the United States. Underlying all of their nonpartisan professionalism, they all had a visceral reason for being here that I lacked. I felt a slight envy. My first reporting assignment was on Jerusalem Day, which celebrated Israel's capture of East Jerusalem in the 1967 Six-Day War. My editor asked me to do a man-in-the-street story, and I thought immediately of Damascus Gate. When I got there, the steps were strangely deserted. So was the plaza just inside. On Khan el-Zayt, men were heaving their bags of spices and buckets of olives back into their stores, rolling up their polyester carpets and stowing them away. They were padlocking the metal gates across their storefronts and retreating into nearby doorways. Plastic bags were skittering around in the breeze. I approached an old man who was standing on the lopsided stone steps leading up to his door. "It's a tragedy," he said. "Il-Nakba, the disaster." He was locking up and lying low. "Go in peace," he said, before his grate clanged shut. When I made it back up to the western part of the city, an old man told me proudly how he'd fought in the war, how he'd helped take Jerusalem. "The first thing we did was pray at the wall," he said. In a way, every story was like that first one. A quote from one side, a quote from the other. There was nothing, it seemed, that could be covered without reference to the conflict. Not a film festival, a crime story, not the gay pride parade in Tel Aviv. The conflict sold the stories to the outside world. At first I thought my understanding would grow, and that by the end of the summer I would have gained some key insight. Like the many outsiders who have tried to broker peace, I thought something other than a permanent state of war would eventually make sense. I thought it was just a question of missing knowledge, and now I was acquiring knowledge every day. And yet things didn't start to make sense. Every fact was countered by another fact. I drilled back through time as though penetrating layers of sediment. There was yesterday when an Israeli bulldozer demolished an Arab home. Then last year when the Arab family had squatted on the property. Then 1967 when the Israelis had taken the property in a defensive war. And on back to 1948 when the Arabs had fled their Jerusalem homes. Then there were the British and the French, who everyone said had messed things up in the first place. And on it went, to the Bible, to millennia ago, when God had granted the land to the Israelites. If you had a stake in things, maybe one narrative or the other eventually started to make sense. If you came in with an equivocal view, things remained irresolute. I pinged back and forth every day between enemy lines. They didn't look like enemy lines. There were no checkpoints, and I could walk between the two sides. But as I did, the language and dress changed. The things people thought and said changed, and suddenly I found myself in a new country. The one thing that didn't change was the food. Falafel sandwiches with hummus were served in both halves of the city. Oranges, eggplants, and olive oil were consumed. Mint and tomatoes were chopped into salads, and meat was slaughtered as specified in the holy books. I befriended Ben, a television producer who worked across the hall from my bureau. He was short and black-haired, the son of Moroccan Jews, Israeli-born and U.S. raised. He'd grown up in the Northwest, and like me, had attended the University of Washington. We talked about professors we had in common, and I felt a connection to him through our shared background. He was an American who knew my gray-green home turf. He was an Arab. He was a Jew. The first time we went out, he ordered me lemonade with mint. Ben called at midday and said he wanted to show me the shuk, the Jewish market. He led me into the Mahane Yehuda, a sprawling web of tightly packed alleys and stalls. I'd poked around its edges, but I'd never been into its heart. Now he took my hand and guided me in, past hawkers shouting, "Bishekel, bishekel, bishekel," over mounds of vegetables. Leading me from a wide alley into a maze of narrower lanes roofed with tarpaulins, we entered an unsigned restaurant, ducking under a low door into a cramped, white-tiled room that was packed with men. Some wore orthodox black and whites, and others were brown-skinned and rough, like tradesmen, with stubble and dirty clothes. The heat, the close quarters, and the absence of women made it feel Arab to me, recognizably Middle Eastern. We sat next to a wall, facing each other across a long table that quickly filled up with diners. They trapped us into place. Ben ordered for both of us, and a man with a dish towel over his shoulder delivered bowls of hot, savory soup filled with vegetables and balls of dough. I asked what we were eating. Matzo Clays, Ben said. I felt like I'd penetrated an unknown place, and I was grateful to him for taking me there. A few weeks later, Ben invited me to a dinner party at his home. He served hearts of palm, eggplant, and lamb with rice. After dinner, his other guests left, and I stayed. He poured us glasses of arak, and we sat on his balcony. The strong liquor's liquid was overwhelming at first, and then it tasted smoother with every sip. A scratchy old tape of Kulthum, the beloved Egyptian singer, was playing on the tape deck. Ben asked me if I was involved with someone, and I said I had a boyfriend in New York, and I asked him the same question back. Ben said he had had a girlfriend until recently, but that she'd moved back to the States, and they'd broken up. Long distance is tough, I said, but he said that wasn't it. Well, it was. We had, he paused, religious differences. She's not Jewish, I asked. No, she is. I felt my comprehension beginning to drift. Rebecca is studying music, he said. She has a beautiful singing voice. In our religion, there's a person who sings liturgical passages in synagogue called a cantor. Rebecca's training to become a cantor. So in the Orthodox faith, which is mine, women can't be cantors. Rebecca was raised in what's known as Reform Judaism. He bit off the last two words with distaste. She would probably make a very good cantor. So, you broke up with her because she's not Jewish enough? That's not the right way to put it, he said, kindly. Orthodox isn't more Jewish than Reformed. But if you mean did I break up with her because she's not Orthodox, that's more or less true. He sighed. I guess I decided I couldn't marry her, and if she changed her faith to mine, she wouldn't be able to become a cantor. Men and women don't even sit together in my synagogue. Ben no longer seemed comfortingly familiar to me, but I coveted his sureness about his place in the world. I took Hebrew classes at the YMCA and noticed the cognates with Arabic. The two languages share mishmish for apricot, tamar and tamara for date, shuk and souk for market, shalom and salam for peace. Reem, a photographer in my bureau, offered me her mother as an Arabic tutor, and I started going to Mrs. Kayali's house 1 or 2 evenings a week. It was in a part of the city I hadn't visited before, a modern part of Arab East Jerusalem. West Jerusalem taxis wouldn't go there, so I walked down to the taxi depot outside Damascus Gate. The house was on a steep road and built of the same white Jerusalem stone as the rest of the city. I brought my Arabic textbooks, and Mrs. Kayali sat with me on the couch, reading and talking, gently correcting me whenever I made a mistake. Every now and then she excused herself to pray. She often offered to feed me, and one night she served a dish called maklub. The word meant upside down. After cooking all the ingredients in a pot, you turn it over onto a plate. The dish was made of lamb, eggplant, and rice, and she served it with yogurt. The lamb was so soft that it fell off the bone. The rice was velvety. The spices were familiar and strange. I took another helping, and Mrs. Kayali looked pleased. How do you make it? I asked, and she said that she would show me. We made a date. Her daughter Reem, who had no interest in cooking, brought me a note from her mother with all the ingredients. I needed eggplants, onions, lamb, butter, and a list of spices, cinnamon, cardamom, turmeric, and something called baharat. I looked forward to shopping, which was a comprehensible task with a comprehensible goal. Reem wrote down the names in English as well as Arabic, except for baharat, which was untranslatable. What is it? I asked. It's baharat, she said. Where should I go? She raised an eyebrow at me. Go to the spice market. I thought immediately of Damascus Gate. I took a bus from the office along Jaffa Road, got out when the old city